It's August 2nd, 2014, and today I interviewed Dale Yocum, who worked at Atari. He was Applications Software Supervisor for the Atari 400 and 800 computers. He was manager and founder of APX, the Atari Program Exchange, and worked as a research engineering manager under Alan Kay at Atari. He worked there from 1979 through 1983. This interview was performed over Skype, me in my home in Portland, Oregon, and him in his home in Portland, Oregon. This is the complete unedited interview. An edited version of the interview will appear in episode 14 of Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast, at ataripodcast.com. The interviewer was me, Kevin Savitz, S-A-V-E-T-Z. You can contact me at savitz.com. Here we go.
Hey, Kevin.
Hey, how are you, Dale?
Doing good, thanks.
Good. So I just went to add you as a contact in Skype, and it said Portland, and I was just like, what? I didn't know. We could have just had coffee or something.
Oh, really? Is that where you are too?
Yeah, I'm in Southwest.
Oh my gosh, how funny.
That's funny.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, how can I help these days?
Okay.
Then maybe you can talk a little bit about what you're up to and how this fits into that.
Sure. Okay. So I am co-host of a podcast which is exclusively about Atari 8-bit computers. It's called Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. And as part of it, we interview people sometimes and try to find modern people and as well as people from back in the day. And so what I do is I would like to interview you. We'll talk about your time at Atari and things there. The complete interview, unedited unless we go off the record or something, will go up on archive.org for historical purposes and people who really care. And a edited version of the interview will be on the podcast.
Okay.
When I take the most interesting, best parts.
Well, it's all going to be fascinating.
I know. I'm sure it is. Let me move my mic here. So, yeah. Give me one more second here. So you volunteer or you work at Catlin Gable School, or is that what LinkedIn said?
Yeah, I did well during the first .com boom, and so at that point I got to decide what it is I wanted to do with the rest of my life, and what I've always enjoyed doing is teaching, and so I just kind of got sucked in, kind of helping, bring the first Lego League to Catlin Gable, and doing STEM stuff with my daughter, and it just sort of grew into this great big thing. And so now I run the whole engineering program at Catlin. So it's kind of starts in middle school and goes through upper school, and we build giant robots and do first robotics competition kinds of things and so on. But it's one of those things that once you get into it, there's no exit strategy. And so
you're in it for life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. I've volunteered for things like that.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm sorry, I got to move away. I'm leaving forever. Okay, so you said you basically had three things at Atari: Applications Software Supervisor for Atari 400 800, APX Manager, Founder, and Driving Force, and Research Engineering Manager under Alan Kay.
Right.
So how did you get started with Atari? I mean, the first machine you owned, or the first time you walked in and said, "Hey, I want a job." Tell me about the very beginning, please.
Yeah, well, I started out, being really passionate about personal computing, and when Atari had an opening for the application software manager, I didn't have any management experience. I was like 24 at the time, something like that. But I came in with this long document of all the different applications we could possibly write and why this would be cool and that would be cool. And for one reason or another, they bought that online, and so they gave me the job. Application software at the time.
What year was this about?
79.
Okay.
And so application software at that point was very much an afterthought. We're a game company, and so there were lots of cool games going on, but there weren't a lot of things that could make practical use of a personal computer. Nobody really knew what those things were. We had some ideas with, the things that had worked at Apple, but we just sort of invented stuff. So the first applications looked like a real scattershot, and they were. Things like Graphit and Scram, the nuclear reactor simulator, and we had statistics program going on and personal finance and so on. The idea was just to test a lot of different things in the marketplace and see what stuck. And if it stuck, then we'd do more of it. Back then, the Atari didn't really have any high-level language except the little BASIC cartridge. And so writing applications in something other than assembler meant that you were writing in BASIC, which is not the greatest environment for doing that with, but that's what we had. We tried not to write a lot of things in assembler, but the Mike's editor, medit, was one of the things we had to do in assembler because we needed an editor, and that was the only game in town. But and so that was a weird place because while we had a marketing department, in future years, you're used to thinking of marketing departments as the ones that kind of figure out what the customer needs are and, bring those to the engineers, and you work in parallel to try to, come up with a solution. But back then, the marketing department didn't know what they were supposed to be doing, and so they just sort of followed our lead. We'd say, what the world really needs is a nuclear reactor simulator. And they'd say, well, okay then, and we go write them a nuclear reactor simulator.
Right.
Yeah, right. And so it was a fun time because there were no rules, and the engineers were very much the ones driving the train. So that went on for a while, but we didn't really have a lot of third-party development going on, and so the machine was suffering from not having a lot of application software or any software, really, just whatever games Atari would create, and then the few random developers that were crazy enough to want to develop software for it. And but we had a lot of software laying around inside Atari, and so I had the idea of starting the Atari Program Exchange. And the idea was it was supposed to be a community of owners of Atari computers, and of the developers inside Atari would sometimes write things on their own time that didn't really have an outlet. So we wanted to have a way to get software out for the Atari that would have a very low barrier to entry. If the software basically kind of did what you said it did, and it seemed like it was vaguely useful, then we'd publish the dang thing. And because our cost to publish was really just to clean up a manual and do some basic testing on it, and then stick it out there in our catalog. Mm-hmm. If we were doing it today, it would be a big online thing where you could submit and download software and maybe pay a couple of bucks for it. Back then there was no internet, and so you're doing it all with this catalog. And right. Apex had this competitive advantage that nobody else could really approach. The third-party software developer couldn't approach because we had the mailing list of every Atari computer owner. And back then, people actually did send in their registration cards. And so we knew who they were. And so we were doing massive printings of this catalog every quarter in order to get the word out and build the Atari software base.
So did you have an inventory of stuff on shelves, or did you create things on demand, more or less?
Yeah, more or less it was on demand. I mean, we would have a couple of 3 copies of everything on the shelves. But when we started to run low, we'd go to Atari disk drives, just like you would have on your normal computer at home, and we'd run off some more. And the cassette software we would actually duplicate on the spot using a giant bank of Technics, I believe, or TX, normal home audio recorders that I hooked up in a giant bank that you could then say, okay, let's go make 25 Eastern fronts, and it would go and take 25 cassettes, and it'll go all these machines would go ka-chunk, and they would all write one copy of the software in normal real time, not in some high-speed duplication. But
Wow. And was it like record, play, or did they all magically
no,
synchronize?
they all magically synchronize. I'm kind of an electronics person as well as being a software person, so I did a lot of the wiring and design of all these things. So yeah.
Awesome. And as for the discs, I mean, was that copied by secretaries and interns, or was it just like you when in a spare moment?
Hold on, just
Sure.
it would start off just being me, and I think at that point we had like 3 employees. We had a tech writer, we had a kind of a general do things, like duplicate disk guy, and we had me, and then that quickly didn't scale very well, and so we kind of started adding more and more people. So we had a staff of maybe 12 people. We had a day shift and a swing shift that would be doing this stuff. And so at the point where I left to go to research engineering, we were cranking out an awful lot of software. I don't remember the exact number, but it was basically 10 people working 2 shifts in order to crank it out. So it was a great place to get software when you couldn't get it anyplace else.
Right. Awesome. I've heard Apex described as the world's first app store.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to think of it. Yeah. It had about the same barrier to entry that like the Apple App Store does. As long as it works and doesn't seem to infect your computer with bugs, and then we'll publish it. We started clamping down as time went on, just because we didn't want to have a 100-page catalog.
Right. So, and how was the catalog produced? Because I mean, that was, for me, getting that catalog was like one of the most memorable things. You had the catalog, it had that always had awesome cover, and then you're just like going through looking at the descriptions of all the new stuff.
Yeah. Well, back then, desktop publishing wasn't really a thing, and so we had a contract graphic designer, Tim McGinnis, whose only job was to figure out how to make this thing producible without it costing a lot of money. And so that's why in the early days, all of the software listings were all one column, because each year, or each quarter, or every 2 months, whenever it came out, we would just be cutting and pasting with real cut and paste, moving those columns around to put them in the right place. The idea was not to have to typeset the whole thing, because typesetting back then was an expensive, time-consuming thing, and we wanted to reduce the barrier to entry again. So, he actually did all the drawings for it too, and back then color separation was an expensive process, and so he would actually sit there with scissors cutting out little color cellophane or whatever it was that he put over the different areas of the front cover. They had to be different colors, and then they would shoot the 3 different colors that way, as opposed to doing a separation, which these days you would
shoot it once with red cellophane, once with green, and once with blue.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, it was a wild time, because we were just making up the rules. We didn't know how to run an app store. We just did what we thought we would want to do if we were consumers.
Right. And as far as the corporation was concerned, you were helping to solve the problem of, we've got this computer, but without a lot of software for it.
Yeah, the corporation. I mean, when I sold the idea of Apex, I just went to the director of marketing and said, "Hey, we've got this problem. We don't have enough software, and look, we've got 30, 40 titles just laying around inside Atari. Why don't we put together a little organization to do that?" And he said, "Oh yeah, fine. Why don't you go deal with it?" So the company gave us office space, but was perfectly happy to just leave us alone for years, because as far as Atari was concerned, they didn't really care how much money we made. It was all about just increasing the software base and being able to tell customers that, hey, look, we've got hundreds of titles here. So for I don't know, the first year we didn't really even do accounting. We just would collect the checks and the cash that would come in, and we put it in literally a shoebox. And then every week or so, I'd just kind of drive down to the bank and say, "Hey, here's my stuff," and put it in the bank. And because we didn't really care how much money we made, we just cared about increasing the software base. And so it was a very lax financial controls. After we started making more money than we spent, then Atari started saying, maybe we ought to pay attention to this, and had auditors come through and maybe clean up our financial system a little bit so that it was more than a shoebox. But yeah,
Interesting. And what about paying out to the authors? My assumption, please tell me if I'm right or not, is that there were a few, kind of like currently, I mean, with any software, there's a few huge winners, and most of them are just making nickels and dimes.
yeah. I mean, a lot of the authors, I think, were doing it just for the fun of getting published and not because they thought they were going to make a lot of money at it. But yeah, it's one of those 80-20 things where 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your titles. And there were a few like Eastern Front and, Dog Days and Canyons of Mars that, made a fair amount of money for the authors. And later on, Fred Thorland did that whole contest thing where there was a $50,000 payout for the
Right.
top program, but that wasn't really part of the original plan. The original plan was just to kind of have fun and revel in the idea that we were all publishing software, and people could dream big and maybe get a smaller check than they expected in the mail. But
Awesome. Yeah, I just last month interviewed Fernando Herrera,
oh
who,
yeah,
who won the first Atari Star Award,
hmm
which was $25,000, and
yeah,
yeah, he said it changed his life.
yeah, yeah.
Um, okay, so you're humming along at APX, and and then what?
Well, it was humming along for a while. As it started to get to be a bigger deal, Atari started thinking, well, maybe this needs adult supervision. And so Fred Thorman was always my boss for Apex, but he had other things that he was managing as well in the software department. But he sort of got phased out of some of those things, and Apex was taking off. And so Atari said, well, gee, hey, how about you go over and manage this thing? And so Fred was going to get transferred over, and being the independent thinker that I am, I didn't really appreciate that. And so I started looking around for other things to do inside Atari. And so that's where the opportunity to join the research department came from. Uh, Alan Kay is this, world-class researcher that invented the idea of overlapping windows and, mouse-driven user interfaces at Xerox PARC. And so Atari brought him on to start a research department inside Atari. And the selling point of that was that, well, Atari's been basically running on batteries all of this time. We haven't been contributing to the state of the art. We've just been taking advantage of the state of the art as it existed. And so the idea was to start actually contributing to advancing the state of computing. And so Alan brought in a lot of world-class researchers from MIT and Xerox and so on to start basically Atari's version of Xerox PARC. And but there wasn't a good way to transfer those inventions into the product divisions. And so I made the pitch to Alan that what we really need is a halfway organization that is really plugged into what the researchers are doing, but is also plugged into what it takes to be a real product and has a better connection to the product divisions. And so that's where research engineering came from. And the idea was that it was a one-stop shop for product development. I don't know what the equivalent would be today. Maybe Google X is one possibility, though it's a little bit more researchy than research engineering. Um, but we would come up with our own product ideas, and we'd watch what the researchers were doing and extract it from their grasping hands whenever they deemed it was potentially done, and then take it a little bit further down the product development track before it would be something that the product divisions could relate to.
Can you give me some examples of things that you did?
Yeah, there was a next generation computer that we were working on called Sierra that was a 286 based computer, which back in the day, 286s were, a real fire breathing dragon.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was that it would have a graphics engine that would offload the processor with as much as it can in terms of doing overlapping windows and such, but also had the full, bitmap display capability, and a 286 in a sound chip that could do real music, which back in the day that was something that people didn't do. And so we had about a 50-person organization in research engineering working on different aspects of that and some other products. So we got it to the point where we had a nice industrial design for it. We had the sound chip actually got produced. It never saw the light of day because it got canned when Atari collapsed. But it actually was a gorgeous sound chip back in the day. And so that would have been quite the computer had IBM not come along with the IBM PC and kind of changed the whole dynamic of what it meant to be a personal computer. People were not looking as much for a graphics intensive computer back then. They were those were all game machines. What you were looking for is something that would run the same software you were running at work.
Right.
And so Atari all along struggled with its identity because Atari was a game company and people identified it as a game company, but Atari really wanted to be a personal computer company, and it was hard to convince Fortune 1000 company that, hey, what you really ought to do is buy a bunch of Atari computers and put them on everybody's desk.
Right.
And so we were always struggling with that. And towards the end, Atari just said, hey, we're going to be a home computer, and that's what we are. But there were a lot of research projects going on in parallel trying to invent the next big thing from a business computing standpoint.
Awesome. Yeah, I've heard that no one ever got fired for buying IBM, but
Yeah.
people might have gotten fired for buying Atari.
Yeah. And, I wouldn't buy an Atari computer as a business computer back then. It took IBM to legitimize that market. And when IBM showed everybody, well, here's what personal computing is. It's, MS-DOS and, character displays and such, then everybody assumed that's what it is. And so,
Do you have any other examples of projects that you guys were working on there?
yeah, we did a personal musical instrument. The idea was that people spend years learning how to play a musical instrument, and wouldn't it be great if there's a musical instrument that was more intuitive? And so we used that sound chip that we were developing for the personal computer to build experimental instruments that were better at playing music the way people make music naturally, which was with your voice. So it never turned out to be a thing. Other people tried doing it after we canned that project. But the idea was that you had a lot of processing power watching what it was you were humming or singing, and then be able to convert that into something that sounded like a trumpet or a piano or whatever. So we did that kind of stuff. The the main thing was Sierra, that personal computer, because it was a way of embodying all the different aspects of what Atari needed in terms of technology, graphics, capability and software and user interface and, so on. Um, but getting that translated into reality was a challenge when the personal computer marketplace was changing out from underneath you.
Right. So how long were you there in that department?
Maybe a year and a half or so. So I left in 83, 84. So, yeah, 83, I guess. So, that was when the big Atari collapse was happening, and they were, rolling out a lot of cost saving things. I mean, Atari was a funny place because during those days in the early 80s, there was no budgeting particularly. The company was making so much money with the VCS and um, not so much personal computers, but especially with the game systems, that there was really no impetus to keep track of it. It was sort of like a clown car driving into a stack of money, and people were just doing what they thought needed to be done and going in a lot of different directions. And some of those would pay off, but most of them didn't. And so the company was burning through a lot of cash. And so when the VCS system started to collapse in terms of sales, or because a lot of that software was getting done by third parties, then Atari had to actually start keeping track of how much money it was spending on things, and so it was fun while it lasted, but it couldn't go on like that forever.
So that was your last position at Atari before you left
Right.
in 83?
Hmm.
So how did you make your exit?
Um, uh, it, I was actually part of a bunch of the layoffs that were happening, which was a good deal for me because the payoff was pretty good. At the time, I was already planning on starting another software company, and so we had our startup team in place, and we were circulating business plans anyway. So it was a pretty great deal. It meant I had the freedom to pursue that a little bit more before ran out of money.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but yeah, it was a wild ride, that's for sure.
So you're there from 79 till 83. So it's about, what, 4 years. And so tell me, uh, what was what was it? What was the culture like? Was it? I mean, I've heard things about hot tubs and cocaine's off of hookers' backs, and it just was. Was it like that for you, or was it?
The personal computer division was quite different than the coin-op game division. We didn't have any of that. It's kind of boring. But you hear all these stories of all the stuff that went on in the coin-op division, and I don't know. I don't have any good stories about that. Um, it was weird in the engineering building when I first got there. I went downstairs and there was this giant, huge, I mean, hot tub is the wrong way to put it. It's like an indoor swimming pool that was hot, that was, could seat 50 people probably in downstairs of the engineering building. And it was never turned on. So it was cold. So it must have been from an earlier day, but I think there were some pretty wild times there back back before Ray Kazar joined as the CEO. Yeah, the Nolan Bushnell years and the Ray Kassar years were quite different, and so Nolan was much more of a free spirit. Ray was much more of an East Coast button down business, really kind of too much so. I don't think he ever used a computer. I don't think he really knew what it was he was selling particularly. It was just, it was a business. And so, he understood in licensing deals. So, you'd license ET or something and then make a game out of it. But nobody really at that point cared how if the game was any good.
So of your time there, what are you particularly proud of something that you created or helped see through?
Um, Probably both Apex and research engineering, but especially Apex, I think was a really, uh, you know, impactful contribution to the company, but also kind of showed a little bit about what things could be going forward. Um, I think anybody in that same position would have done the same thing. So I can't say I was any sort of a brilliant, strategic mind in putting this thing together, but it was a way for the personal computer division to get a foothold that we wouldn't have had before. Also, the people that I brought into Apex were really just great team, and the tech writer, for example, Ann Kelsey, she could write a manual in a day. And they're not long manuals, but for God's sakes, I mean, she had to understand the game that she or the product that she was writing about, write the thing and pump it out in a day. It was pretty amazing.
Wow. Do you own any Atari machines today?
I must admit that I do not, which is a sad state of affairs. Back in the days, you say, "Well, what do I want to keep this thing for?" And now I wish I had one. But,
Yeah. Um, so back in the day, which machine did you have? A 800 or?
yeah, it was an 800. With a couple of 3 disk drives and so on. With what was it, all of 100K or something on each disk.
Right.
Yeah, I mean the FCC didn't do us any favors when we were developing the 800. Do you know that whole story?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So we ended up with really underperforming peripherals because of the FCC, and so a a serial interface. It was a 19K baud or something going to a disk drive is a pretty crazy thing to do, but that's what we had to do right at that point to pass the
To
FCC.
keep the emissions low.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and this giant, cast aluminum casting inside the 800 in order to keep all the emissions inside. Pretty amazing.
All right. So if you could send a message to the Atari community that still exists, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
um, well, the Atari machines were really groundbreaking in their day in terms of their graphics capability, and we it took a long time in order to for the software to catch up with that. There were things like Star Raiders and such early on that kind of showed that what was possible, but it took a long time for us to get to the point where we could actually take advantage of it. And so I appreciate the fact that you're all hanging in there and kind of seeing what the machine was, and perhaps get a glimpse of what it could have been. The machine was really ahead of its time in a lot of ways, and through some marketing blunders and such, maybe it wasn't the success that the Apple II was. But I just want to thank you all for keeping us in your thoughts.
Awesome. Good answer. All right. Well, is there anything else I should ask you, or that's interesting that you want to talk about? Any other stories, or?
Um, well, yeah. I mean, Atari Personal Computer Division was really carved off quite differently than the game division, and it was a lot more buttoned down. And the management of it didn't really understand what it was that they had, and so there were a lot of corporate types from mainframe software companies that would come in and would be running it, and the culture of what it means to be a good computer for the home and a good computer for Burroughs Corporation are quite different things, and it I don't know that Atari ever really got that. And to be fair, the whole personal computer market was just figuring out what it was to be a home computer.
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know that we ever figured out that it was a lot different than what you had at work. The Apple II, was closest, but there was a lot of Apple IIs that ended up in corporate environments, because of VisiCalc or whatever other killer application that you needed. At the time, though, we thought there was likely to be a difference. We just didn't know how to express that. In in hindsight, it would have been better to really push the fact that here's a machine that's a absolutely killer game machine that'll also be really great at helping your kids do their homework and so on. Um, and that message got out there sort of, but it it was always kind of tempered by and you could use it at work too, and it wasn't really going to be a happening thing. I think Atari would have had to spin off a different division and call it something other than Atari in order for it to have a hope in the personal computer business. I don't know that anybody could have overcome the IBM PC juggernaut, though. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
it was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Okay. If I can help in any other way, let me know.
All right. Great. Thanks, Dale.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.